Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of RehabU Movement and Performance Therapy, and I'm going to talk about the 3 best exercises for the low back. So what are the 3 best exercises for the low back? It depends. So if you know me by now, you probably know my answer to that is either it depends or there's no such thing as a best exercise for anything, right? So I get that question a lot. What's your favorite exercise for this? Or what do you think the best exercise is for low back pain? And it's kind of the same thing as getting the other question I get a lot, which is I have pain in my left shoulder, what should I do, okay? It depends, okay? So for low back pain, I cannot tell you what the best exercises are, but I can tell you what the best strategies are, okay? And then the best exercises for that person will depend on the strategy that you use, okay? So the idea that we can use one exercise and call it the best exercise really is a little bit far-fetched because certain exercises work well for a lot of people but might not really work for someone else, okay? So granted, there are exercises that, you know, we can qualify as go-to. They work well with a lot of people, but that really doesn't make them the best exercises in my book. It's just statistics. Like, they can work well, but it might be a fluke that they worked well for a whole bunch of people and you could use it for someone and it would be really contrary to what they need. Okay, so when you're dealing with low back pain, the thing that you need to remember as far as your strategy is that first off, you need to address or take into consideration the pain trigger and or the movement bias. So there are different triggers with low back pain. People can have, for example, flexion intolerance, where they don't tolerate flexion well, or positions of flexion is what gets them into pain. They could have extension intolerance, so the opposite. They don't tolerate extension well. Positions where there's a lot of extension work gets them into pain. Some people may have compression intolerance, so loading the spine is really not comfortable for them. Some people have shear intolerance, so if you find someone who says, you know, I can do like all kinds of things, but if I have to take a heavy box and put it in the trunk of my car, that just blows out my back, like that's just really painful. So that would be indicative of some intolerance to shear load, okay? And another thing that people have is a flexion movement bias or an extension movement bias. So some people tend to have too much flexion, where everything they do, every time they load them, they can't control that flexion in the lumbar spine, and then an extension bias is the opposite. So they have an extension bias where as soon as you load them, they will lock up their back into extension. And then that becomes problematic. They start to have pain in extension, they start to have pain in flexion, okay? But they're in that habit of always moving that way, and that's one thing that your strategy needs to address. Okay, so we need to take that in considerations, and often they go hand in hand. And the other thing with low back sometimes, truth be told, is you'll get people who are flexion and extension intolerant. You'll get people who have pain with all kinds of movement. Okay, if someone has symptomatic degenerative disc disease, they sometimes have pain with movement, period. Okay, so you'll have to find ways of getting them out of pain, find ways of helping them move outside of their pain triggers, okay? So first part of your strategy then is respecting that intolerance, whether it's flexion, extension, compression, shear, or combination, and correcting the movement bias, okay? So let's take the example of really common low back exercises that we see. We see dead bugs, we see bird dogs, right? So if you have someone who is flexion intolerant and has a flexion movement bias, so they tend to work in flexion too much, probably your dead bug is not going to be the best exercise for them because it's an anti-extension exercise, therefore it requires a bit of a flexion moment, and that might be uncomfortable for them. So for them, a bird dog is probably more interesting. So you guys know what a bird dog is, and I'm actually going to get André Félix to do a modified version of the bird dog where he pushes this arm up into the rack, and then he's only going to do the right leg where he pushes out. So yeah, that's it, come back, and then just extend out here, there we go, okay, and back. Okay, so the idea of having the arm overhead if you're worried that they're going to get into flexion when they do a regular bird dog, then having that arm overhead, I have found, cues them to stay in a little bit more extension. So that's just a way of further modifying your bird dog to ensure that they don't go into flexion, for example, for someone who's flexion intolerant, okay? If you were doing a dead bug, so go over on your back, and you had someone who really wasn't able to control bringing down the opposite arm and leg, then nothing stops you from doing, come back to middle, just the leg. And then if that's too much, because for some people it can be, nothing stops you from doing just an arm. Okay, now obviously the weight of an arm is not a lot, and you could increase that by putting weight in the hands. Okay, so there's no reason why you can't further modify those two exercises based on what you need, but the idea is that these are both good exercises, and I could say, well, it's the best exercise for the low back, but I could use the bird dog, and if it was someone who's extension intolerant, it wouldn't be good for them, so it's not the best exercise for the low back, okay? Now, another strategy that we see a lot is one go-to area that people work on for low back pain is the glutes, right? We're always talking about how we need to activate the glutes properly to save the lower back, and a lot of that is about distributing load, right? So if I have a better understanding of hip extension and specifically how my glutes work to extend my hips, I'm going to be able to incorporate my glutes and have my glutes contribute to distributing the load versus my low back working by itself. So a lot of people are doing glute work for low back pain, which also is a good strategy, but also needs to take into consideration whether someone has an extension intolerance or a flexion intolerance. So for example, if I take just a glute bridge exercise, so lie down on your back and do a glute bridge, if he's extension intolerant, he may not like this glute bridge, okay? Back down and up. Right? So he may not like that because he gets into some relative lumbar spine extension, right? So initially it's not going to be a good exercise for him, and I could use an exercise like a chest supported glute raise or a reverse hyperextension, or something where I could have him in a little bit more of a flexed position. Okay, so same thing with, yes, working the glutes is a go-to practice for low back pain, but there's a way of choosing your exercise based on your extension bias, flexion bias, or your intolerance, so which movements trigger pain, okay? The second strategy I think you should have in your management of low back is working on frontal plane stability. So I always say that the best core exercises are probably carries. The more carries you can do, the better you can be. So we know the QL gets very activated when the spine is loaded, and we need the QL as a stabilizer. So of course, doing unilateral carries, so carrying objects only on one side, is going to be interesting. However, we'll get you here in a second. So if I decide that I want to work on lateral stability, so I have him do a unilateral carry, I give him a really heavy dumbbell just on one side, what does that also do? It creates an anti-rotation exercise, right? So if he's got facet joint issues, that might bother him. So again, you know, loaded carries are great, but you're still going to have to adjust them based on how the individual feels. Okay, so you may need to do a more of a bear hug carry to get him into a little bit more flexion if he's extension intolerant, such as with facet joint stuff. And with facet joints, extension and rotation is going to be particularly irritable. Okay, the other thing with carries is that obviously if you're doing heavy dumbbell carries, he's going to have to pick them up from the floor. And then if he's flexion intolerant, picking up heavy dumbbells from the floor is going to be pretty difficult. So what you could do with someone who's flexion intolerant, now this isn't as high as we might have it, but you could have a heavy med ball on a surface that's chest level, and he'd be able to just grab it at chest level in a bear hug and carry it, okay? But now what he can do from this level is he can kind of squat down, keep his torso fairly upright, and come and carry the heavy ball. Okay, so you can adjust all of your carries as well. So for me, I'm never, good, you're good. It's actually not that heavy. We didn't have a heavy one. So for me, the idea of saying, well, what's your best exercise? I'm never able to answer that question. Like, I'm literally never able to, because I'm not comfortable with saying, well, do this or do that, because I'm always like, well, if I tell you to do this, but then finally that person has some sort of facet joint issue or some sort of extension intolerance that might really bother them, and then I'm going to be like, well, I didn't give you the right information. Because the best exercise doesn't exist, what you need to understand is who the client is working with and what's the best exercise for that person in that circumstance. So I always say context is key, right? So you need to figure out what the best exercises are for the individual that you're working with based on what their pain is like and what their movement biases are like. What's the movement that you need to change? What's the behavior that you need to change or modify or control? That's part of the strategy, okay? So best exercises for low back pain, it depends.